Well, hello again. We are now on September 10th assignment, and we kind of want to think back to yesterday's reading that you did silently and think about what did we learn about Brian from yesterday. So we learned that based on his actions, quite a bit about Brian. The idea that he took that hatchet and put it on his belt, even though he thought it was hokey and kind of goofy, and he was mad at his mom, he did it anyway. He didn't want to really hurt her feelings any more that he could tell that she was already hurting. So that tells me that he's a kind of kid. Whoa, you saw that. It kind of scared me. So let's try that again. Let's see if we can put something behind that to hold it. Technical difficulties. There we go. Could have been worse. Let's see if I can. There we go. So when we think about Brian through our story, we want to keep in mind our end in mind, which is identifying character traits by drawing conclusions. Those things go hand in hand. To draw the conclusion of what's going on in the story will allow us then to identify those character traits. And that's really what we're doing with him. Now, vocabulary, still old school. We got it on the wall. However, you're also going to be utilizing Quizlet. Now, I've said that the last 3 days, and I'm assuming that we're going to be able to do that. So you should have had a code on the first day when we did orientation, so that you can get on and got on successfully. So what you're going to be doing today is you're going to be working about 10 minutes on Quizlet, going over the vocabulary and utilizing any type of activity that's available there for that 10 minutes. So we have lashed, which is tied. We have grimacing, which is making a pained face. Audible is able to be heard. A spasm is a cramp. Rigid is stiff. Rebelled is resisted. So you've rebelled against something. Visualize is making that mental picture. And abated is where something's lessened over time. So usually if you have an injury, if you've, dropped something on your foot or you smash some fingers, that as you add ice or with a little bit of time through that day, that hurt kind of goes away. If you've got a bad headache and you take some Tylenol, the headache will start to abate or go away with some time. So that's where we are. So today, for your simple solutions, you would have pulled up, or you will pull up, a reading from The Wind in the Willows again, and it's called A Tedious Business. And so this will be uploaded by itself in Google Classroom, because you will be uploading another item as well today. So we want to make sure that we have 2 separate items, okay? So I have had a couple of students who are struggling with remembering to do it as 2 separate items. I can't score it if it doesn't come in that format. So I want you to remember that. It's too hard for me to be looking around in 3 or 4 different places to find your work. So I need you to do it in that particular format, just so that you know, as well as I know, right where to look. All right? Okay, so these lessons are going to go a little quicker just because we are adding that simple solutions into our daily piece, and you all are going to be doing the readings on your own for the most part. Now, I may do a little bit of the reading just because I love to read. But I think that's kind of where we are. All right, let's pick up to page 13. If you are wanting to read independently, then you will need to go ahead and kind of jump off the video and open up the pages for today. Feel free to read on your own at this point. I would suggest you give me just a minute because we're going to do a little bit of reading and then we're going to identify character traits and drawing conclusions, because that is the skill of the week. We need to see, or you need to be able to hear what those skills are and how they're being utilized throughout the story. Okay, so give me a minute before you jump off. Chapter 2. For a time that he could not understand, Brian could do nothing. Even after his mind began working and he could see what had happened, he could do nothing. It was as if his hands and arms were lead. Then he looked for ways for it not to have happened. Be asleep, his mind screamed at the pilot. Just be asleep, and your eyes will open now, and your hands will take the controls, and your feet will move to the pedals. But it did not happen. The pilot did not move except that his head rolled on a neck impossibly loose as the plane hit a small bit of turbulence. The plane. Somehow the plane was still flying. Seconds had passed, nearly a minute, and the plane flew on as if nothing had happened. And he had to do something. He had to do something, but did not know what. Help. He had to help. Well, he stretched one hand toward the pilot and saw that his fingers were trembling, and he touched the pilot on the chest. He did not know what to do. He knew that there were procedures, and you could do mouth-to-mouth on victims of heart attacks and push their chest, CPR. But he did not know how to do it. And in any case, could not do it with the pilot, who was sitting up in the seat and still strapped in with the seatbelt. So he touched the pilot with the tips of his fingers, touched him on the chest, and could feel nothing. No heartbeat, no rise and fall of breathing, which means the pilot was almost certainly dead. Well, at first, Brian is in shock and doesn't do anything. And then he thinks to help the pilot. So probably for the pilot's sake as well as his own, he's kind of, thrust into action. And the idea, though, that all of a sudden he's just like, oh, I got to help the pilot. This tells me that he cares about people. He cares about what's happening to the pilot here, because he's remembering the CPR that took place, and he's like, but I can't even do that because he's strapped to the seat. So he's thinking about ways to help. So here we go. Please, Brian said, but did not know what or who to ask. Please. And the plane lurched again, and it hit more turbulence, and Brian felt the nose drop. It did not dive, but the nose went down slightly, and the down angle increased the speed, and he knew that at this angle, this slight angle down, he would ultimately fly into the trees. He could see them ahead on the horizon, where before he could see only sky. He had to fly it somehow. He had to fly the plane. He had to help himself. The pilot was gone, beyond anything he could do. He had to try and fly the plane. Well, he turned back in the seat, facing the front, and put his hands, still trembling, on the control wheel, his feet gently on the rudder pedals. Well, you pulled back on the stick to raise the plane. He knew that from reading. And you always pulled back on the wheel, so he gave it a tug, and it slid back toward him easily. Too easily. And the plane, with the increased speed from the tilt down, swooped eagerly up and drove Brian's stomach down. He pushed the wheel back in and went too far this time, and the plane's nose went below the horizon, and the engine speed increased with a shallow dive. Too much, and he pulled back again, more gently this time, and the nose floated up again, too far, but not as violently as before. Then down a bit too much and up again as before. Then down a bit too much and up again, and very easily. And the front of the engine, cowling, settled. When he had it aimed at the horizon and it seemed to be steady, he held the wheel where it was, and he let out his breath, which he had been holding all this time, and tried to think what to do next. It was a clear blue sky day with fluffy bits of clouds here and there, and he looked out the window for a moment, hoping to see something, a town or a village, but there was nothing. Just the green of the trees, endless green, and lakes scattered more and more thickly as the plane flew. But where? He was flying but did not know where. He had no idea where he was going, and he looked at the dashboard of the plane, and he studied the dials and hoped to get some help. Hoped to find a compass, but it was all so confusing. A jumble of numbers and lights. One lighted display in the top center of the dashboard said the number 342. Another next to it said 22. Down beneath that were dials with lines that seemed to indicate what the winds were doing, tipping or moving, and one dial with a needle pointing to the number 70, which he thought, only thought, might be the altimeter, the device that told him his height above the ground or above sea level. Somewhere he had read something about altimeters, but he couldn't remember what or where, or really anything about them. Slightly to the left and below the altimeter, he saw a small rectangular panel with a lighted dial and two knobs. Well, his eyes had passed it over 2 or 3 times before he saw what was written in tiny letters on top of the panel. Transmitter 221 was stamped in the metal, and it hit him, finally, that this was the radio. The radio, of course. He had to use the radio. When the pilot had been hit that way, he couldn't bring himself to say that the pilot was dead. He couldn't think of it. He had been trying to use the radio. Well, Brian looked at the pilot. The headset was still on his head, turned sideways a bit from his jamming back into the seat, and the microphone switch was clipped into his belt. Well, Brian had to get the headset from the pilot. He had to reach over and get the headset from the pilot, or he would not be able to use the radio or call for help. He had to reach over. Now let's think for a minute. The author has used that phrase, he had to reach over, 3 times. What is he trying to kind of evoke to us right now? He's trying to evoke that Brian's kind of creeped out. And he's creeped out because he's realizing he's going to have to touch the dead pilot to get the headset. Now, I don't know about you, but I ain't into touching dead people. So I would be creeped out by this, even though I knew it had to be done. So that's where they're going here. Now, his hands began trembling again. He did not want to touch the pilot, did not want to reach for him, but he had to. He had to get the radio. And he lifted his hands from the wheel, just slightly, and held them, waiting to see what would happen. The plane flew on normally and smoothly. All right, he thought. Now to do this thing. He turned and reached for the headset and slid it from the pilot's head, one eye on the plane, waiting for it to dive. The headset came easily, but the microphone switch at the pilot's belt was jammed in, and he had to pull to get it loose. When he pulled, his elbow bumped the wheel and pushed it in, and the plane started down in a shallow dive. Well, Brian grabbed the wheel and pulled it back too hard again, and the plane went through another series of stomach-wrenching swoops up and down before he could get it under control. When things had settled again, he pulled at the mic cord once more and at last jerked the cord free. It took him another second or two to place the headset on his head, and he positioned the small microphone tube in front of his mouth. He had seen the pilot use it, had seen him to press the switch at his belt. So Brian pushed the switch in and blew in the mic. Well, he heard the sound of his breath in the headset. Hello? Is there anybody listening on this? Hello? He repeated it 2 or 3 times and then waited, but heard nothing except his own breathing. Panic came then. He had been afraid, had been stopped with the terror of what was happening, but now panic came and he began to scream into the microphone, scream over and over. Help! Somebody help me! I'm in this plane and I don't know. And he started crying with the screams, crying and slamming his hands against the wheel of the plane, causing it to jerk down and then back up. But again, he heard nothing but the sound of his own sobs in the microphone, his own screams mocking him, coming back into his ears. The microphone, awareness cut into him. He had used a CB radio in his uncle's pickup once. You had to turn the mic switch off to hear anybody else. And he reached to his belt and released the switch. And for a second, all he heard was the whoosh of the empty airwaves. Then, through the noise and static, he heard a voice. Now, Brian is in a horrible situation right now. I can't even imagine the fear that he's going through. But he is very determined about staying alive. I mean, he's trying to figure out how to fly the plane. Now he's made himself touch the pilot to get the headset to try to get somebody to tell him or to help him on what to do. So he has to overcome this fear of touching this pilot, though, to make it happen. So a character trait to me of Brian is that he's brave and he has a strong sense of wanting to survive. And he does that by overcoming that fear of touching this dead guy. So let's go up to the front. And we're walking. I'm hoping that this will stand up and not fall down. So we shall see. Woohoo! It is. All right, now what we are going to do is break our questions down just like we would if we were in class. I just got to kind of orientate you a little bit. Your Team Talk questions look a little different because I type them into a Google Doc just for ease. So we're going to break them down and then I'm going to give you your assignment. So after we break questions down, if you're wanting to read independently, you are going to read pages 19 through the end of the chapter today, okay? If that is where your evidence is also going to come for answering the questions. So if you took a book with you, you will want to go ahead and sticky note at that point and kind of get that done so that you've got it. And we're just going to get going here. Number 1, why does Brian worry about where the plane is going? And with a multiple choice question, we want to make sure how many answers are we allowed to give. So for this particular kind of question, we know we're going to choose 1. If they wanted more than 1, they would tell you choose as many that apply or choose 2. But for this one, we know it's just 1. So they're wanting you to tell why Brian worries where the plane is going, okay? Number 2, Brian cannot bring himself to stop the plane's engine and force the plane to crash. What does this tell you about his will to live? Now, that's a pretty long question. So they're giving you a statement before the question. So the question is the second part. So I want you to explain to me what this tells you, this statement up here, and I'm drawing an arrow, about his will to live, okay? So the statement above it is what they're wanting you to think about. And then what are we learning about Brian because of that? 3, what is Brian's plan when the plane runs out of fuel? And then how does he prepare for that plan? So this question actually has 2 questions. So you're going to tell what Brian's plan when the plane runs out of fuel is, okay? And then the second part is you're going to explain how he, and he, that pronoun is referring to Brian. How does Brian prepare for his plan? Okay, so that's 2 separate things. One is, what is his plan? Okay. And then the second part is, how does he prepare for the plan? Okay. So that's what you're trying to think about. And last but not least, what does it mean when the engine dies? So I want you to tell me what it means when the engine dies. So he's flying along in the plane, and then all of a sudden, it just stops. The engines quit working. What does that tell you? You're going to be drawing a conclusion, okay, based on that. You will see that 2 and 3 have this right, okay? That tells us that that is our end in mind question. That is the skills that we're working on this week. So those questions are scored a little more strict, I guess. You want to make sure that you keep the rubric in mind at all times, guys. So to get that 100, it has to be complete and correct, has to give me evidence, okay, and a restate. So that's the goal at all times, is that 100 answer. You want to make sure you write your answers in your reading journals, and then you're going to upload those into the Google Classroom for me. So 2 Google Classroom uploads today. You've got simple solutions, and then you've got your questions. All right, so going to sign out. For those of you who are reading, like I said, you are reading pages 19 through 24, and then you are answering questions. So if you're using the book, use the book. If you need to look at the pages online, they're there waiting on you. See you later, guys.